everyone, welcome back to Fragments of Faith. One of the hardest parts of grief is that there comes a point when everyone else goes back to normal. Not because they're cold, not because they've forgotten, not because the loss didn't matter. It's just that their lives keep moving. The funeral's over, people go back to work, the calls slow down, the texts get less frequent, the rhythm of ordinary life starts to come back for everyone around you. And that's natural. That's what happens. But if you're the one carrying the loss, that can also be its own kind of pain because the world starts to sound normal while your life still doesn't. Everyone else is settling back into routines, back into schedules, back into the things that were already waiting on them and meanwhile you're still trying to figure out how to live in a world that feels permanently altered. That's part of grief that people don't always know how to talk about. There's a lot of language for the funeral. There's language for shock, there's language for those first few raw days when everybody knows something terrible has happened. But what do you do with the part that comes after that? What do you do when the attention fades, when the quiet sets in and the loss is still just as real to you as it was before? Because for a lot of people, that's when a different kind of grief begins. And that space after the funeral, when the world moves on, but you don't, that's what we're talking about today.
Yeah, and I think that's the part people don't really know how to talk about. I mean, in the beginning, everyone understands what's happening. There's shared understanding that something devastating has just occurred. But as time goes on, the world keeps moving. I mean, people go back to their routines. And the person who is grieving is still carrying something that hasn't changed. And that's where things can start to feel complicated because loving someone who is grieving for a long time can be hard. I mean, eventually people start wondering things they might not say out loud, like whether you should be doing better by now, whether you should be trying to move forward more, or there's a phrase that's said a lot, they would want you to be happy. And sometimes those thoughts turn into advice. I mean, I've been told before that maybe I should give Riley and Harrison's things away so that other kids can use them. I understand that intention behind that. I mean, I do. But grief doesn't move on the timeline that makes other people comfortable.
And I think that's what gets so hard about this part of grief. Nobody has to come right out and say, you should be past this by now, because after a while, you can feel it without anybody saying it. You can hear it in the pause after you bring them up. You can feel it when people don't quite know what to do with the conversation or when somebody changes the subject. Not because they're trying to be hurtful, but because they get uncomfortable and they want to move things somewhere lighter. And I think that's what makes it so complicated because most of the time it's not malicious. It's people not knowing how to stay in something that still hurts when from the outside it seems like enough time has passed that it shouldn't hurt this much anymore. But grief doesn't really care how much time has passed on the calendar. And that's where a lot of people end up feeling alone in a way that they didn't at the beginning. Because at the beginning, there's almost a kind of permission to be completely wrecked. And later, that permission starts to feel less clear. So now you're not only carrying the grief itself, you're also trying to figure out how much of it there's room for. After a while, you start editing in real time. You hold something back. You soften something. You give the shorter answer because you can feel that not everybody knows what to do with the full weight of it, and that's exhausting. Grief is already heavy, but once you start feeling like you have to manage other people's comfort with your grief, it becomes heavy in a different way. It's like the loss is still there, but now there's this second layer on top of it where you're trying to make sure that your pain isn't too much for everybody else. And I think a lot of people know exactly what that feels like, even if they've never had words for it.
One of the strange things about that stage of grief is how it shows up in really ordinary moments. I mean, it's not usually big dramatic moments that people might be imagining. Sometimes it's the really embarrassingly small things. You're in a store and you see something you might have bought for them. You hear a song that they loved. You walk past a place that holds a memory. And now suddenly you're just standing in the middle of a completely normal day, carrying something so heavy that nobody else around can see. I mean, those moments don't stop happening just because time has passed. If anything, they become a new, like, normal in your life. And I think that's part of what people on the outside don't always realize. Grief isn't just something you feel when you sit down and think about the person you lost. It's something that weaves itself into the ordinary parts of your day: the grocery store, a TV show, a holiday, a random Tuesday afternoon because you saw someone wearing a bow tie and it reminds you of your son. And those moments don't really have a timeline. They just become part of how you move through the world now. After a while, that's part of what gets confusing because from the outside, it can look like you're doing fine, when really grief has just gotten quieter and less constant.
And I think another part of this is that people don't always see is what loss does to the future. Because grief isn't only about missing someone in the present. A lot of times, you're also having to come to terms with all the things that were just sitting out there in front of you that are never going to happen the way you thought they would. And some of that can hit in ways you don't expect. It might be a milestone coming up. It might be a holiday. It might just be some completely ordinary moment when you realize, without warning, they were supposed to be a part of this too. And I think that kind of grief can feel especially strange because you're not just remembering what happened, you're running into what isn't going to happen now. And that's a different kind of pain because loss doesn't only remove someone from your life as it exists today, it also reaches forward and changes things that were still ahead of you. And I think most people miss that a lot when they think about grief. They think grief is mostly about memory, mostly about looking back, mostly about what happened then. But a lot of grief has to do with what happens next. It has to do with all the ways you had quietly built that person into your understanding of the future, not in some dramatic or formal way, just the normal human way we all do when someone is part of our lives. We all assume there will be another conversation. We assume they'll be there for something coming up. We assume there's still more time than there actually was. And then one day you realize the future you had in your head is gone now too. So now you're not only grieving the person, you're grieving the life you thought was still coming. You're trying to make peace with the fact that certain moments are still going to arrive, but they're going to arrive differently than you thought they would. And sometimes that realization hits hard, not because you were sitting around trying to dwell on it, just because time keeps moving. And every so often, it brings you to something that reminds you all over again that this loss did not stay in one moment. It kept going. It moved into birthdays. It moved into family gatherings. It moved into plans you haven't even made yet. And I think that's part of why grief can keep catching people off guard even long after the funeral because it's not only attached to the past, sometimes it meets you in the future.
Actually, milestones are one of the places where that really shows up for me. When Reagan graduated high school in 2023, She wore my husband's necklace that held Riley and Harrison's ashes so they could, in spirit, walk across the stage. I mean, it was a really emotional day for all of us. There was so much pride and happiness in that moment, but there was also this awareness that two other people who should have been part of that day weren't there. Now, I do try very hard to be careful with that as a parent because I never want Reagan to feel like your accomplishments are somehow tied to my pain or you have to carry that weight for me. Because my living child deserves to celebrate moments of joy. But grief has this way of existing alongside those moments. I mean, sometimes I'll see Reagan doing something, hitting a milestone, stepping into another part of life. And there's this quiet thought in the back of my mind, Riley and Harrison should be doing new things too, growing up, getting older. They would be 11 and 13 this year. There's a whole set of experiences that come with those ages that I'm also never going to see. Harrison doesn't get to play soccer and be coached by his dad like Reagan was. Riley doesn't get to terrorize me by hiding around corners and scaring me like Reagan still does. Riley would be starting high school after this summer, and that's really hard to think about too because I'm missing out on the drama that would come with her being this hilarious, dramatic teenager. And I'm missing out on moments where there's missing teeth or they're growing out of their clothes, getting their own opinions, maybe even hating me a little bit, like kids do. Honestly, I would give anything to be hated by them, to have them alive and arguing with me the typical way that kids sometimes do. That's part of the future grief that we're talking about. I mean, it's not just missing them in the past, it's realizing there are parts of life unfolding right now that they were supposed to be a part of.
I think that's the point where grief stops feeling like something you can keep in one part of your life. Because when the loss keeps showing up in the middle of real life like that, it eventually starts touching deeper things too. It can change the way a person moves through the day. It can also change what used to feel steady on the inside. And that's where this conversation is very different than just talking about sadness, because now we're dealing with the fact that grief has worked its way into the inner parts of a person. It's not only about missing someone, it's about what that missing starts to do to your heart and to the part of you that used to know what to do with faith a little more easily than maybe you do now. So even if somebody never says it out loud in exactly those words, this is usually the place where grief starts raising spiritual questions. And based on the conversations we've had, that's kind of where we're at. That's kind of how this all started. It's kind of where our conversations led. And it wasn't that we were trying to force the conversation there. It just gets there on its own. After a while, loss can change the sound of things that used to feel familiar. Prayer can feel different. Silence can feel different. Even hearing somebody say something about God can land in a completely different way than it would have before. And that can be hard to admit because people are usually more comfortable talking about grief as pain than they are talking about what that pain may have stirred up spiritually. But that part is real too, and that's part of our conversations that we want to share with those of you who are listening, because sometimes grief doesn't just leave you hurting. Sometimes it leaves you unsure what you even do with God in the middle of it.
I think that's part of grief that people inside the church don't always know how to sit with. Because when loss starts touching on faith, people often feel like they need to defend something. And I don't think most people mean any harm when they say the things that they do. But sometimes the language that people reach for can be taken in ways that they don't intend. I mean, people say things like, God has a plan or they're in a better place. And I understand the hope people are trying to express when they say those things. But when you're a parent who has buried your child, that sentence hits a little bit differently because what place is supposed to be better than a home where they're loved, a place where their parents would have done anything for them? So sometimes those phrases don't feel comforting. Sometimes they just raise more questions. And then there are the verses people quote when they're trying to give you hope. I've heard Revelation 21 a lot. He will wipe every tear from your eyes, and there will be no more pain, death, or mourning or crying. I know I butchered that. I mean, it's a beautiful promise, but the reality most grieving people are living in is that the tears are still very much there. The mourning is still there. The pain is still there. And so you find yourself sitting in this very strange place where you believe the promise, but you're also living in the space that comes before it. And that space can feel really complicated because sometimes grief doesn't just leave you hurting. Sometimes it leaves you trying to figure out what to do with God in the middle of it all. And sometimes well meaning Christians try to solve that tension quickly. I've even had people say things like, well, if you don't believe in heaven, how will you ever see your kids again? They said that on the rare occasion that I felt safe venting my anger at God or questioning him. And I know the intention behind that is probably to encourage faith. But when someone says that to a grieving parent, what it can feel like is that suddenly you're expected to have the right faith answer while you're still grieving your child. Like, if you don't say the right sentence about heaven, somehow you've lost your children twice. And that's a really heavy thing to put on someone who's already carrying way more than they ever expected to carry.
I think this is where grief can get made heavier by the way people respond to it, because hope and pressure are not the same thing. And grieving people can feel the difference immediately. And sometimes what gets offered as hope can feel like pressure, because when you're already overwhelmed, the last thing you need is the sense that there's now a right way you're supposed to respond to your grief. Most people are not trying to be difficult in that moment. They're not trying to sort out some big theological position. They're just trying to live inside something that hurts. So when somebody reaches for a verse like Revelation 21 too quickly, I understand why. It is a beautiful promise. It matters, but it's still a promise about where all of this is going. And grief is lived in the part of the story where you're not there yet. That's the tension for me, because the person who is grieving is still waking up in the part where the loss is real. They're still living with the absence. They're still having to deal with the fact that life keeps moving while this ache keeps showing up. So it's not that the promise is wrong, it's that it's being used to move past the pain instead of making room for it. And that's why I keep thinking about the kind of language scripture gives people when they're still in the middle of it. Um, that's very forward looking in Revelation. But there's a moment in Mark chapter 9 where a father says to Jesus, I do believe, Help me overcome my unbelief. And honestly, that sounds a lot more like grief to me than somebody acting like they have all the answers. Because sometimes faith in grief sounds like somebody's still reaching for God while also being honest that this has shaken something in them. It sounds like wanting to believe and not knowing what to do with everything you're carrying at the same time. And I think we need room for that. Not just room for the promise at the end, but room for the person who's still trying to speak from the middle of it.
That verse you mentioned, the Father saying, I believe, help my unbelief. I'd honestly never really noticed that verse before, but hearing it now, you're right. It does sound a lot like what grief can feel like on the inside. Because when something like this happens, I mean, faith doesn't necessarily disappear, but something inside you can feel shaken in a way that you didn't really expect. I mean, there was a time in my life where my understanding of God felt very steady. I grew up without much hesitation. I mean, God was there. He was loving. He was good. So when I hear that Father say, I believe, help me with my unbelief, I mean, I don't really feel that that's someone abandoning their faith. It sounds like someone reaching towards God while also admitting that something inside them has been shaken. That feels very familiar to me because grief can leave you in this place where part of you still believes and another part of you is struggling to understand how the world you're living in fits with the faith that you were taught. And I know there's not a sentence that resolves that. But what I do know is that explanation and comfort are not the same thing. I mean, people often try to explain tragedy, but what grieving people are usually looking for or longing for is something different. They just want to be seen. They don't want to be rushed towards an answer because even when someone believes in God, that belief doesn't make the pain disappear. And once the funeral is over and everyone goes back to their lives, the small ways that people show up or don't start to matter a lot more than people realize. Some things people do in that season are incredibly helpful. Sometimes it's very simple things like checking in weeks later when everyone else has stopped, being willing to say the person's name instead of avoiding it, sitting with you in a conversation that isn't comfortable without trying to fix it or wrap it up. Those things matter more than you'd think. But there are also things people say, usually with good intentions, that can feel dismissive when you're grieving. Things like telling someone they need to stay strong, that everything happens for a reason, that their loved one is in a better place, or trying to rush someone towards being positive because the sadness makes other people feel uncomfortable. Most of the time, those things are said with kindness in mind, but when you're grieving, they can make you feel like the depth of what you're experiencing isn't really being seen because grief doesn't need to be explained away. It just needs room to exist. And one of the most meaningful things someone can do for a grieving person is remember that grief doesn't end after the funeral. I mean, it continues into birthdays, into holidays, into months later when the numb wears off and the absence is suddenly very loud. Ongoing care looks very simple, actually. I mean, just a message or a phone call, someone remembering that a hard day is coming up. And that's actually what I try to do for a friend of mine who lost her mom. I'm terrible with dates. I forget birthdays. I mean, my brain just doesn't hold on to those things really well. But the week of her death anniversary, I put in a reminder in my calendar every year to check in with her. Not because I have the perfect thing to say. I mean, I don't. No one does. but because I want her to know that someone else remembers that this week is hard for her, that her loss matters, that the day didn't pass unnoticed. And when I reach out to her, I'm not trying to fix anything. I'm just letting her know that she's not the only one holding on to the memory of that week. Sometimes showing up for someone who is grieving looks just like that. No answers or explanations, just remembering and being willing to say, hey, I know this might be heavy, and I just want you to know I'm thinking about you.
And I think that's where a lot of people get it wrong, especially people who really do care, because showing up for grief usually looks a lot less impressive than people think it should. It's not having the perfect words, it's not finding the right verse at the right moment. A lot of times it's just being willing to stay present without trying to make the grief wrap up faster than it actually does. And I think that's hard for people, especially in church spaces, because we're so used to wanting to offer something meaningful. We want to help. We want to we want to bring comfort. We want to say something to speak some comforting truth into the situation. But sometimes the rush to say something true can actually keep us from being with the person and what's true for them right then. And that's where I think this connects to what we talked about in the last episode. Sometimes the loving thing is not adding more words or even backing away. Sometimes it's being the kind of person who can let grief stay grief without needing to turn it into something cleaner. And I think that grieving people can feel the difference. They can tell when someone's really with them, and they know when someone's trying to steer the moment somewhere easier. And that shows up long after the funeral too, because once that first wave passes, what starts to matter is who still remembers. The ones who still check in when there's no obvious reason to, and those still willing to let that loss be part of the conversation instead of acting like bringing it up will make things worse. And I think church communities especially need to pay attention to that, because we can move to resurrection language really fast. We know how to talk about hope. We we know how to talk about heaven, and those things matter, but if that's the only language we know how to offer, then we're missing a huge part of how scripture talks about grief. Scripture also makes room for sorrow that's still unresolved, and people speaking to God from the middle of pain, not just from the other side of it. If all we offer to grieving people is victory language, it can start to feel like the heavier parts of grief have nowhere to go. So to me, being there for somebody after the funeral often looks a lot more ordinary than people expect. And honestly, I think that presence says more than most explanations ever could.
I think that's really the heart of it. I mean, grief doesn't ask people to solve anything. It doesn't need perfect sentences or the right verse or the right moment or someone trying to move the conversation somewhere more hopeful before the person who is hurting is ready to go there. Most of the time, grief is just asking for space to exist, to acknowledge that the loss didn't end when the funeral did. Because the people who are grieving are still living with that absence in everyday life. And what often stays with them the longest is not the explanations they were given, it's the people who stayed, it's the people who remembered, the people who were willing to sit in the moments that did not have a clear resolution. And if you're someone listening who cares about a grieving person in your life, that's actually a very freeing moment because it means you don't have to carry the pressure of saying the perfect thing or the right thing. You don't have to solve their grief. You just have to show up, remember them, let their loss be part of the conversation months and years later. And if you're someone who is grieving and some of what we talked about today sounds familiar, you're not wrong for feeling that way. Grief has a way of touching every part of life, including faith. And that doesn't make you weak. It just means you're living honestly inside something very real. And that's part of what we're trying to do in this space, in this podcast, is to make room for conversations that don't rush past the hard parts. So wherever you find yourself today, whether you're carrying grief yourself or walking alongside someone who is, thank you for being here with us. We'll see you next week.